Most people cannot explain what the war in Somalia is actually about anymore, which is exactly the problem that reveals everything else. They know there are bombs, and they know there is Al-Shabaab, but if you ask them when the war started, who is fighting whom, or why it never ends, the answer dissolves into vague gestures about terrorism and chaos. There is a reason for that confusion, and it is not because Somalia is uniquely complicated. It is because this is not one war, but stacked, overlapping conflicts that regenerate themselves, and the system built around it has learned how to survive inside the violence. In 1991, the Somali state collapsed in a way that goes beyond reform or weakening. The central government ceased to function entirely, and what replaced it was not anarchy in the abstract sense, but clan-based power structures filling the vacuum where the government had been. Warlords controlled neighborhoods, militias controlled roads, and for 15 years Somalia existed without a functioning state while the world barely paid attention beyond humanitarian crises and occasional military interventions that ended in withdrawal. Then something unexpected happened in 2006 when a coalition of Islamic courts unified and brought order to Mogadishu for the first time in over a decade. The Islamic Courts Union was not Al-Qaeda, nor was it a monolithic extremist movement, but rather a loose alliance of Sharia courts, some moderate, some hardline, funded by Somali businesspeople who were tired of paying protection money to warlords and wanted basic governance. They cleared the streets of checkpoints, reopened the airport and seaport, and for 6 months Mogadishu experienced something it had not known since 1991. Stability. Ethiopia invaded in December 2006 with US backing and intelligence support, dismantling the Islamic courts in less than 2 weeks under the stated goal of preventing an Islamist takeover. But the actual result was something else entirely because the invasion radicalized the youth wing of the Islamic courts. A small militia called Al-Shabaab, which had been a minor faction within the broader movement, refused to surrender. They retreated south and began an insurgency, not against warlords or clan rivals, but against what they framed as foreign occupation. And here is what rarely gets explained. Al-Shabaab was not created by the invasion, but it was hardened by it. The group went from a few hundred fighters to thousands within 2 years because Ethiopian troops were seen as Christian invaders in a Muslim country, and every airstrike, every checkpoint, every civilian casualty became a recruitment tool that transformed a marginal militia into a full insurgency with territorial control, popular support in some regions, and an identity built entirely around resistance to foreign interference. By 2008, Ethiopia withdrew after realizing the occupation was unsustainable, but the damage was done. Al-Shabaab had grown into something far more dangerous than what existed before the intervention. The African Union deployed AMISOM in 2007 to fill the void left by Ethiopia's exit, and the mission had a clear mandate: stabilize Somalia, protect the transitional government, and degrade Al-Shabaab's capacity to operate. Yet what followed was not victory, but a grinding stalemate that would last for nearly 2 decades. AMISOM, which later became ATMIS in 2022, was structured around a gradual drawdown plan where African Union forces would transfer security responsibilities to Somali national forces in phases, with the final exit scheduled for December 31, 2024. The problem is that every phase has been delayed, every timeline has been extended, and the mission that was supposed to be transitional has become semi-permanent, not because the threat disappeared, but because leaving became harder than staying. Here is what the international community downplays. Al-Shabaab does not need to win in the conventional sense, because insurgent groups survive through endurance, reversals, and adaptation, rather than decisive battlefield victories. The pattern repeats itself with predictable regularity. Government forces, supported by African Union troops and US airstrikes, launch offensives and recapture territory. Officials celebrate the gains, claim momentum, and project confidence that the insurgency is weakening. Then, weeks or months later, Al-Shabaab quietly retakes the same towns, re-establishes control over the same roads, and reasserts its presence as if the offensive never happened. This is not a failure of tactics, but a reflection of structural realities that make territorial control fluid and reversible. Somali forces lack the capacity to hold what they take. African Union troops are stretched thin across vast territory, and Al-Shabaab has the patience to wait out temporary setbacks because time is on their side in a war. Where international missions operate on political timelines while insurgents operate on generational ones, the financial and logistical pressures surrounding peacekeeping drawdowns reveal uncomfortable truths about how these missions function and why they persist despite failing to achieve their stated objectives. ATMIS faced chronic funding shortfalls, with estimates exceeding $100 million by the time the mission was scheduled to exit in December 2024. And the financial burden fell disproportionately on a few donors. The European Union provided over €2.2 billion to AMISOM and ATMIS over 15 years, yet calls for other nations to match this support went largely unanswered. The mission operated under constant pressure to demonstrate progress, justify its budget, and prepare for a transition that kept getting postponed because the conditions on the ground never aligned with the timelines dictated by international bureaucracies. When ATMIS finally ended on December 31, 2024, it was replaced by OSOM, a new mission with a slightly different name, but essentially the same structure, the same challenges, and the same unresolved questions about who will actually secure Somalia when international forces eventually leave. This pattern of mission restructuring and timeline extensions raises a question that rarely gets asked openly. What happens when the institutions built around war develop incentives to sustain rather than end the conflict? This is not a conspiracy theory but a structural observation about how prolonged wars create systems, funding streams, careers, institutional frameworks, political leverage that adapt to the presence of conflict and become difficult to dismantle, even when peace becomes possible. For troop-contributing countries, AMISOM and ATMIS provided training, equipment, and financial support that strengthened their own militaries. For international donors, the mission justified budgets, demonstrated commitment to counter-terrorism, and maintained influence in the Horn of Africa. For Somali politicians, the presence of international forces provided security that allowed them to govern from Mogadishu without fully consolidating control over the country. And for organizations tasked with peacekeeping, the mission became a permanent operational environment rather than a temporary intervention. None of these actors deliberately sabotage peace, but the system as a whole benefits from a managed level of conflict that justifies continued engagement, and that creates a dangerous dynamic where peace threatens the structures that war has made functional. The quiet US war in Somalia operates almost entirely outside public awareness, which is precisely what allows it to continue indefinitely without the political scrutiny that accompanies visible military commitments. US Africa Command has conducted over 111 airstrikes in Somalia since President Trump returned to office in January 2025, dramatically escalating a campaign that had been relatively restrained under previous administrations. The strikes target both Al-Shabaab and ISIS Somalia, with the stated goal of degrading their ability to threaten the US homeland, American forces, and citizens abroad. What makes this war particularly insidious is its invisibility. Somalia disappears from headlines for months or years at a time. The American public has no idea airstrikes are being conducted weekly, and Congress exercises minimal oversight because the operations are framed as counterterrorism rather than war. This invisibility contributes to permanence because wars that nobody is watching do not face the same pressure to end. There are no deployment rotations making headlines, no body bags returning home, no protests demanding withdrawal. Just an ongoing campaign of airstrikes that continues regardless of who occupies the White House, because the bureaucratic and strategic logic driving the mission persists across administrations. Somalia's position in the Horn of Africa makes it a chessboard where regional rivalries and security partnerships shape outcomes far more than internal Somali politics ever could. And this geopolitical dimension ensures that the war remains internationalized even when the fighting appears localized. Ethiopia has intervened multiple times to prevent Islamist control of Somalia because it fears spillover into its own Somali majority regions. Kenya maintains troops as part of AMISOM/ATMIS and conducts its own operations because Al-Shabaab has carried out devastating attacks in Nairobi and other Kenyan cities. The United States views Somalia through the lens of counterterrorism and great power competition, worrying that withdrawal could create a safe haven for groups plotting attacks against American interests while also preventing China or Russia from filling the vacuum. Meanwhile, Gulf states, Turkey, and other external actors provide aid, training, and political support to different Somali factions, each pursuing their own strategic objectives. The result is that Somalia becomes a site where everyone has interests but nobody has ownership, and peace requires alignment among actors whose priorities are fundamentally incompatible, a condition that guarantees continued stalemate. What most people get wrong about Somalia is the assumption that it is uniformly chaotic But that oversimplification erases the reality that terrorism is not the only driver of conflict, and some regions have achieved relative stability even as the national conflict persists. Somaliland, which declared independence in 1991, functions as a de facto state with its own government, currency, and security forces, maintaining peace and democratic elections despite lacking international recognition. Puntland operates semi-autonomously with its own administration and has managed to contain ISIS Somalia to a small, isolated pocket in the mountains. Even Mogadishu itself has experienced significant rebuilding. New hotels, restaurants, businesses, and a growing sense of normalcy coexist with ongoing suicide bombings and targeted assassinations, creating a surreal environment where life continues despite the war. This complexity matters because it reveals that Somali society is not incapable of creating order. The problem is that localized stability does not translate into national peace when the central government remains weak, federal-state relations are fractious, and external actors continue fueling different sides of the conflict. The central revelation that ties all of these dynamics together is this: the war is not endless because Somalis cannot fix it, as the lazy narrative suggests. It persists because layered conflicts combined with external incentives, fragile governance, and an adaptive insurgency have created a self-renewing loop where every attempt to end the war generates new conditions that sustain it. Al-Shabaab does not need to defeat the government because survival is victory in an insurgency. And as long as they can regroup after losses, exploit governance failures, and present themselves as an alternative to corrupt or absent state authority, they will continue to exist. The Somali government cannot consolidate power because it lacks the capacity to govern beyond Mogadishu, depends on international forces for security, and remains divided by clan politics and federal-state tensions that prevent unified action. Every attempt to build a national army or police force founders on the same problems of corruption, desertion, and factional loyalty that have plagued security sector development for decades. African Union forces cannot leave because withdrawal risks collapse, yet their presence creates dependency and removes the pressure on Somali leaders to find political solutions. International donors cannot stop funding because abandonment would be seen as failure, yet continued funding sustains a system that shows no clear path to self-sufficiency. The United States cannot stop airstrikes because pulling back might allow groups to reconstitute and plot attacks, yet the strikes generate local resentment, complicate governance, and occasionally kill civilians, which feeds the very narratives that insurgents use for recruitment. Each actor is trapped in a dynamic where their actions are individually rational, but collectively produce an equilibrium of managed conflict rather than progress toward resolution. And this equilibrium persists not because anyone wants it, but because dismantling it requires coordinated action that none of the stakeholders can achieve. What Somalia reveals about modern conflict is profoundly unsettling. Wars can become systems that institutions learn to function inside rather than problems they work to solve. And once that transformation happens, ending the war becomes more disruptive than continuing it. The forever war in Somalia endures not because peace is impossible, but because the modern world struggles to dismantle systems that have adapted to conflict, and until that fundamental reality is acknowledged, the pattern will repeat itself, not just in Somalia but anywhere war becomes infrastructure.